Just before the break of dawn, the earth held its breath. The ground didn't shake in anger, but in memory, as if recalling something it had buried long ago. Then came the sound, like 100 horses tearing through the darkness, their breath fire-hot and ancient, echoing across the hills. War cries followed, sharp, rising, slicing through the cold like a blade through cloth. It wasn't just noise, it was a reckoning. Martha stood barefoot on her porch, her lantern flickering in the wind, hands trembling around a rifle she barely knew how to use. She wasn't a soldier. She had never been trained for war. But she knew what it meant to face something that could not be reasoned with. In front of her, ghost-like through the fog, rode 50 Comanche warriors, faces painted in streaks of ash and crimson. At the front, a man cloaked in wolf pelts. His presence alone made the air colder. His eyes locked on hers, unmoving. Then he raised a single hand, and the riders froze as if the world itself obeyed him. But it wasn't him that broke her. It wasn't the painted horses or the silence that came too fast after the noise. It was the figure just behind him. A small boy on a painted pony, barefoot, still, staring at her with eyes too old for his face. He was the one she had saved, found bleeding and half-conscious beneath the thorn bushes behind her chicken coop. She had lifted him into her arms. Without a word, without asking why he was there or who might come looking. She had tended to his wounds with herbs and quiet hands, not because she owed him, but because someone had once done that for her. And now, here he was, sitting behind a man who looked like death, riding straight through a memory. Was this her? Betrayal? Or had she just misunderstood what saving really meant? The truth is, Martha didn't know. But that's what makes this moment powerful. Because sometimes in life, you stand at the edge of everything you've ever lost and realize it's all coming back to test you. Not with bullets, not with fire, but with the faces you thought you had rescued and the ghosts you thought you had outrun. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a question hanging in the frozen air. What do you do when the person you saved returns, and you don't know if they came back as a gift or a warning? And there's something deeply human in that silence. See, Martha wasn't just defending her home that morning. She was defending the decision to care, when the world had given her every reason not to. She was defending the scarred part of herself that still believed in kindness, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was dangerous. This isn't a story about cowboys and Indians. It's a story about choices, about what happens when we offer shelter to the vulnerable, and then wonder if we made a mistake. It's about the fear of betrayal, yes, but also about the terrifying, beautiful risk of love in a broken world. And that's why the boy's presence was so heavy, because he didn't just represent Martha's past, he represented her hope. And hope, when it's real, is always a little bit dangerous. So Martha stood there, rifle in hand, facing 50 warriors, and one small boy who might undo her completely. Not because he wanted to, but because love always asks more of us than we are ready to give. And if you've ever stood at a crossroads like that, if you've ever looked at someone and wondered, did I save them or did I just invite the storm? Then you already know what came next isn't just part of a story. It's part of being human. And sometimes, being human means standing in your doorway, barefoot and bruised by life, and facing the wild with nothing but memory, mercy, and a rifle you never learned to fire. Welcome to Martha's story. And if you think this is the end, it's only the beginning. At the edge of a town that had long forgotten how to be kind, there lived a woman named Martha. Her house leaned slightly to the left, like it was tired of standing, and the shingles on her roof curled at the edges, weather-beaten and worn. No one came that far out unless they had to. And even then, they didn't stay long. She wasn't dangerous. Not really. But people said things about her, the kind of things that start as whispers and grow like weeds. That she talked to the dead. That she saw things no one else did. That bad luck followed her like a shadow she couldn't shake. In small towns, truth doesn't matter as much as repetition. And Martha's name had been repeated too many times in hushed tones, behind closed doors, for her to be anything but. Cursed in their eyes, she didn't try to change their minds. Not anymore. There comes a point when silence is easier than defense. When you stop explaining who you are and just let the world believe what it wants. But that silence didn't come from peace, it came from pain. Once, long ago, Martha had walked tall. She laughed loudly, danced barefoot in the rain. She had a husband, then a kind man with a crooked smile and hands that made her feel safe. He left one morning during the war to help a neighbor with wounded cattle. He never came back. All they found was his hat, stained with blood, and an arrow through the crown. No body. No burial, just absence. Loss, when it lingers long enough, doesn't just break you, it reshapes you. The left side of Martha's face bore the scar of a fire, the same one that had swallowed the last pieces of her old life. Her limp came with the winter chill, and her voice had grown softer over time, like even it had learned not to take up too much space. She didn't sit with others at church. The preacher never said her name aloud. And at potlucks her name was always the one missing from the sign-up sheet. Children stared. Mothers pulled them close, as if sorrow could be contagious. But the thing about Martha was she kept going. She planted potatoes in one corner of her yard, kept chickens in another. Her Bible sat worn and unread on the shelf, collecting dust alongside her memories. Days passed like wind across dry grass, quiet, unremarkable, and just a little bit sad. It's easy to forget someone like Martha, easy to look the other way. But if you ever took a closer look past the scar, the limp, the silence, you'd see something else. You'd see a woman who had lost almost everything and still chose to stay. And that's something rare, isn't it? In a world where so many run when it gets too hard, she stayed, not out of pride, not even out of hope, but because there was still breath in her lungs and dirt under her fingernails, and sometimes that's enough. We talk a lot about strength like it looks a certain way, big gestures, loud voices, brave choices. But sometimes strength is a woman, sitting alone on her porch, shelling peas while the world pretends she doesn't exist. Sometimes it's waking up when you have no reason to, feeding chickens, boiling water, surviving, quietly, and Martha had survived, not cleanly, not gracefully, but fully. The scar on her face, that wasn't her shame, that was her proof. The limp in her walk, a memory etched into bone, her silence, a language she had learned when the world forgot how to listen. You could call her forgotten, you could call her strange, but you couldn't call her weak. Because the thing about people, like Martha, is they carry whole histories in their stillness. And on the day her world would shift again with a wounded boy, a drifter with a rifle, and a town that would come knocking with torches of judgment, she would remember that stillness isn't the same as surrender, it's preparation. For something bigger, for the moment when a quiet woman on the edge of town would become the one standing in the doorway between what had been and what could still be. It was late in the day, the kind of dusk that stains the sky the color of old whiskey. Martha sat on her porch, watching the wind chase dust across the yard. That kind of silence doesn't just feel empty, it feels haunted, like the land itself is waiting for something it can't name. And then she heard it. Not loud, just wrong. A staggered breath, sharp and uneven, from somewhere near the chicken coop. She grabbed the lantern, not out of fear, but out of habit. When you've lost as much as Martha had, you stop being afraid of what's out there. You start being afraid of what's already inside. Behind the coop, beneath a thorn bush, lay a boy. Bare-chested, no older than 10 or 11. His skin was marked with paint and old blood, his left leg wrapped in a strip of cloth so soaked it barely clung to the wound. He didn't move. But his eyes were wild alive. Like a cornered animal deciding whether to flee or fight, Martha didn't say a word. She just knelt slowly, hands open, palms out. You learn over time that not all communication requires language, especially not pain. Pain speaks its own dialect. It's written in the way someone flinches, in the tightness around their eyes, in how still they stay when they should be running. He didn't run, couldn't maybe, but something passed between them in that moment, something that had nothing to do with names or tribe or history. Just two souls broken in different ways, recognizing each other across the silence. He was Comanche. That was obvious from the markings along his shoulder, the shape of his jaw, the bone necklace around his neck. And that made everything harder. Because where Martha lived, Comanche meant enemy, meant danger, meant suspicion and locked doors. But Martha didn't see that. What she saw was a child wounded, alone, and burning with fever. So she carried him inside. He was light, fevered, his skin hot to the touch. Her knees nearly gave out, not from the weight of the boy, but from the weight of what she was choosing to do. She laid him on her late husband's cot, pulled a cloth from the wash basin, and began cleaning the wound with quiet hands and steady breath. He hissed when the cloth touched his skin. She shushed him gently. There were no words. He didn't know hers. She didn't know his. But somehow the silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the kind of care that doesn't need permission. Over the next 2 days, Martha nursed him the only way she knew how. Herbs boiled down to bitter tea. Roots crushed in a wooden bowl. A cool cloth on a burning forehead. And silence. Always silence. Because what do you say to someone who's only known you for your kindness, not your scars? On the second evening, the fever broke. He opened his eyes not with fear, but with the soft confusion of someone waking from a bad dream. He looked at the ceiling like he recognized it, like he'd seen it before in some distant vision of safety. And then, later that day, he smiled. It wasn't big. It wasn't dramatic, but it cracked something in Martha, something that had been locked up for years behind grief and whispers, and the long ache of being alone. She hadn't seen a real smile in months, maybe years, and this small, crooked, quiet smile from a child who should have never survived that bush was enough to remind her kindness still mattered, even if no one saw it. Even if the town would judge her for it. Even if it came at a cost. She didn't ask where he came from. Didn't ask who he belonged to. She just knew someone would come, eventually. But for now, the boy was there, and he was breathing. And he had stopped shaking in his sleep. And sometimes that's enough. Because there's a kind of love that doesn't need words. Doesn't need blood ties. It's the kind that sees a broken thing and chooses not to turn away. That's what Martha gave him. And in return, he gave her something she didn't know she needed, a reason to care again. Sometimes the people we save us right back. Not with grand gestures, not with promises, just with a look, a breath, a smile. And somewhere in the hush of that second night, in the glow of a single oil lamp flickering against the wall, a woman once forgotten by the world remembered who she still was. A protector, a healer, a mother in the deepest sense of the word, even if no one else would call her that. The day Ellis walked up to Martha's gate, the wind was restless. It came in from the east for the first time in weeks, colder, heavier, like it was carrying something it didn't want to say out loud. He didn't ride in like the others. No horse, no dust cloud. Just a lone figure in a weather-beaten duster, walking like a man who'd already been everywhere and didn't care much to be anywhere anymore. He stopped at the fence and rested one hand on the latch, the other near the revolver at his side, not threatening, just ready. His hat was pulled low, casting half his face in shadow. But when he looked up, there was something in his eyes that made Martha pause, an honesty carved out of weariness. "Ma'am," he said. Nothing more. No explanation. No pitch. Just that. And in that strange, heavy silence that only people carrying too much past can create, she understood something. He wasn't there to take. He wasn't even there to ask. He was simply arriving. Martha didn't welcome strangers, not anymore. But something about Ellis felt different. He didn't flinch at her scar. Didn't glance nervously at the house. Didn't comment on the boy-shaped shadow behind the curtain. He just stood there, calm and still, like someone who had known fire and learned not to fear the burn. She let him drink from the well. Didn't offer food. Didn't ask questions. That night, she didn't lock the door, not out of trust, but out of a quiet curiosity. By morning, he had stacked kindling neatly by her porch. By afternoon, he was hammering at the old fence. He worked without speaking much. When he did talk, his words were deliberate, like each one had to earn its place. Martha liked that. She'd grown tired of people who filled silence with noise. Ellis wasn't like the town men. He kept his distance, gave her space, and looked her in the eye. That alone felt like a kind of respect she hadn't known in years. Then the visitors came. 3 of them. Men from town with hands that rested. Too comfortably on their belts and smiles stretched too wide to mean well. They called her Miss Martha like it was a warning. Said they'd heard she had company. Asked if she was safe out here all alone. Behind the screen door. The boy barely breathed. The moment was tense, thin as glass. Until Ellis stepped into the light. Not aggressive, not afraid. Just present. He wiped his hands on a rag like he'd just finished fixing a wagon, looked each man in the eye, and said calmly, "The lady's got company already. That's all she needs tonight." It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't not a threat either. The men shifted in their saddles. One of them spat in the dirt. Another muttered something about choosing the wrong friends. But they left, kicking up dust and resentment behind them. And that's when it happened. Later that night, as the wind curled around the corners of the house and the fire crackled low, the boy spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Just one word. "Father." Martha froze. The boy pointed to the horizon, to where the wind came from, to where drums might have been beating in the distance, too low for her ears but not his. It wasn't clear if he meant Ellis or someone else. But the word itself hung in the room like smoke, thick, undeniable, and full of old pain. And in that moment, something shifted in Martha. She realized this stranger, this quiet man with worn hands and a history he hadn't told, he wasn't just passing through, not anymore. There are people who walk into your life like storms, loud, sudden, destructive. Then there are those who show up like weathered stone, silent, unmoving, shaped by time and endurance. Ellis was the second kind. He didn't explain who he was, didn't offer a past. But in the way he stood between her and danger, in the way the boy looked at him, Martha understood. Some people don't need to be defined by what they say. They're revealed in what they choose to protect. And in a world where so many only look out for themselves, sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is stand quietly beside someone who's been alone for far too long. They came without warning. No torches, no weapons, just voices sharpened by righteousness and eyes filled with everything but mercy. It was dusk when Martha heard the wagon wheels grinding across the dirt road, the crunch of boots on gravel, and the cold finality of people who came not to ask questions, but to deliver judgment. There were 6 of them. 3 women, 2 men, and the preacher. Folks she had known for years. Folks who used to nod at her husband in the general store, who once passed her baked pies after Sunday service. Now they stood like a jury in front of her porch, holding their silence like it was scripture. At the front stood Mrs. Avery, arms crossed, lips tight, hat pinned too carefully to her curls. "You can't shelter them, Martha," she said, voice trembling with the kind of conviction that's learned, not felt. Not after what happened to your husband, not after everything. The preacher held his Bible low, not in reverence, but like a threat. This land doesn't belong to you, he said. Not if you're using it to harbor sin. Martha didn't flinch. But something in her chest went cold. Behind her, the boy hid again, just a shadow behind a faded curtain. Ellis was nowhere. In sight, she wished he were. I didn't invite you here, she said, her voice more gravel than tone. We're not asking, the preacher answered. Then it happened. One of the men, Tom Kinley, the same boy who once danced with her daughter at the spring, fair stepped forward and threw something at her feet. A rag doll, faded red thread, black button eyes. Martha stared at it like it was a ghost. Because it was. That doll had belonged to her little girl. The one no one in town spoke about anymore. The one buried out beyond the tall grass where the wind never stopped crying. You left her there, Tom said, his voice flat. You let her die while you chased ghosts in the woods. And just like that, the ground gave way. Martha's knees buckled. Not from the words, but from the weight behind them. Her hands hit the porch, not to reach for the doll, but to keep herself from drowning in memories too loud to silence. No one moved, not a hand to help, not a whisper of sympathy. They had done what they came to do. So they turned and left. One by one, leaving only the doll behind like a gravestone made of thread. The boy opened the door slowly, just wide enough to see her, wide enough to know. She turned her face so he wouldn't see the tears. Some griefs are too sacred to witness. That night, Martha didn't pack a bag, didn't leave a note. She walked straight through the back gate and into the woods bare-handed, directionless, and already half-ghost herself. Snow came suddenly, thick and bitter. A cruel April storm, as if even the sky had decided to punish her. The branches scratched at her arms. The wind howled like wolves. Still, she didn't stop. She welcomed the cold, welcomed the numb. Maybe she thought if it took her, she'd finally be free. She collapsed beneath a cedar tree, curled into herself, no prayers, no begging. Just a woman undone, letting the cold wrap around her like a final blanket. And maybe, in another version of the story, that would have been the end. But not this one. Because somewhere in that storm, someone found her. Not God, not the preacher, not the townsfolk who cast her out, Ellis. He didn't come like a hero, no white horse, no grand rescue. Just quiet footsteps through snow and a coat lowered gently over her shoulders. He didn't say much. Just, I've been looking for you. She opened her eyes slowly, barely believing he was real. You don't know me, she whispered. He knelt beside her. Maybe not, he said, but I know what running looks like. He didn't try to lift her, didn't ask her to be strong. Instead, he sat with her in the cold, held her scarred hands in his, let her shiver, let her breathe. And maybe for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel judged. Didn't feel cursed, she just felt seen. Because sometimes, the most radical act isn't standing your ground. It's letting someone sit beside you when the world has already walked away. They didn't speak much on the way back. There were no apologies, no promises. Just the sound of snow crunching beneath their boots and the quiet rhythm of Martha's breath, shaky but still steady. Ellis walked beside her, not ahead, not behind shoulder to shoulder, letting her lean on him when her legs gave out. He didn't offer words to fill the silence. Sometimes the most healing thing someone can do is simply stay. By the time they reached the cabin, dawn had started to pull its pale light across the hills. The fire was still burning. The boy had kept it alive. He didn't ask where Martha had gone. Didn't cry or panic, just waited. And when she stepped through the door, snow clinging to her coat, he ran not to hide, but to help. That night, nothing grand happened. No speeches. No catharsis. Martha sat in her chair, blanket around her shoulders. Ellis stayed by the hearth, quiet, carving something from a block of pine. The boy eventually crept closer and crawled into her lap without a word. She held him like something precious, something fragile and stubbornly alive. Because he was. In the days that followed, they settled into something that didn't have a name, but felt a lot like home. Ellis didn't leave. He fixed the hinge on the back door, reinforced the fence before the wind could take it down. He never talked about why he stayed. He just stayed, and Martha never asked. Maybe she knew the answer. Maybe she didn't need to. The boy began to heal too, not just the wounds on his body, but the quiet panic in his eyes. He slept deeper, ate more, started smiling again. He still didn't speak much, but his silence was softer now. Less like a shield, more like a choice. One morning, Ellis handed him a small wooden horse hand-carved, simple, but smooth as bone. The boy held it for a long time, then looked up, searching for something. For meaning, for connection. What should we call you? Martha asked softly. The boy glanced at Ellis, then back at her. Thomas, Ellis said, his voice low. Name belonged to someone I once knew, a good man. Deserved to be remembered. The boy nodded, as if claiming that name meant something bigger than anyone in that room could explain. And from that moment on, he wasn't just a boy anymore. He was Thomas. It's a strange thing, how a name can plant roots where there was once only drifting. How it can give someone a place to stand, even if the ground beneath them is still shaking. Martha began to change too. She started walking taller when she went into town, head no longer lowered, hands no longer clenched at her sides. The whispers were still there, the looks hadn't vanished. But she didn't shrink under them anymore. Not since Ellis began. Leaving hand-carved bullets on the fence posts, a quiet warning to anyone who might come looking for trouble. She traded venison for flour, eggs for cloth. Even began planting again, her hands no longer trembling like they used to. The limp in her walk didn't vanish, but her stride grew stronger, more certain. The woman who once vanished into the woods now stood with her back straight, her chin high, like someone who had remembered how to breathe. Thomas never left the yard when she went to town. But he started learning English slowly from Martha's soft instructions and from Ellis's quiet stories told while whittling wood on the porch. He listened with eyes wide, soaking in the world through voices instead of fear. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the cottonwoods and painted the grass gold, Ellis leaned on the porch rail and watched Martha brush Thomas's hair with hands gentler than the wind. You ever think about leaving? He asked. Every day, she answered. He nodded slowly. But you stay. I stay, she said, because if I leave now, they win. And maybe that was the truth of it. Maybe healing wasn't some sudden thing. Maybe it came slowly like spring thaw. Like sap rising through an old tree that had survived too many winters. Maybe it came in moments. A child's name, a hand-carved toy, a fire that never died out. Because sometimes redemption doesn't ride in on a horse. Sometimes it just shows up one morning with an axe, a story it never tells, and the willingness to stay long enough for something broken to begin again. Some stories don't stay buried. No matter how deep you push them, how many winters pass, how quiet your life becomes, truth has a way of finding its way back. Usually on horseback, carrying a badge and a name you were hoping never to hear. Again, that morning started like any other. Martha was tending to Thomas's ankle near the stove, the boy humming a soft tune under his breath, something with no lyrics but full of memory. Ellis had gone into town, nails, molasses, maybe a few extra bullets, nothing urgent. But then came the sound of hooves. 3 riders, dusty coats, faces that didn't smile. The lead man dismounted slowly, the way someone does when they want to be seen. His beard was gray, his eyes sharp with the kind of confidence that only comes from power. He took off his hat and smirked, not out of politeness, but possession. "Martha Walker," he said. "Didn't expect to find you playing house with a savage and a ghost." She didn't answer. Just stood her ground. "Because there's a kind of strength that doesn't show in your hands, but in how still you can keep them." "You know who I am?" he asked. She nodded once. "Marshall Dent," he chuckled. "So Ellis told you about me." "Not much," she replied. "Well, allow me to fill in the gaps." He stepped closer. "Your new friend. Deserted a company wagon train. Left 2 men behind to die so he could disappear into the trees. That's not bravery, Miss Walker. That's cowardice with a conscience." Behind her, Thomas clutched her skirt. He didn't understand the words, not fully, but he understood the danger. Dent's voice, his posture, they didn't need translation. When Ellis returned, the sun was already starting to lean west. Martha sat on the porch steps, arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes red but calm. "You knew he'd come," she said. Ellis nodded. "I figured it was only a matter of time." She didn't rise. Didn't move toward him. "Is it true?" she asked. He didn't avoid the question. Just crouched beside her, resting his hands on his knees, like someone settling into a memory. "Too heavy to carry standing up." "It is," he said. "But not the way he tells it." She waited. "I was ordered to wipe out a Comanche camp near the river," he continued. "Women, children, elders. They hadn't attacked anyone, just existed too close to where they weren't wanted. 2 soldiers had gone in ahead. By the time Ellis arrived, the killing had already begun. I couldn't be part of that," he said. "So I buried the dead, left my badge on my captain's saddle, and walked away. Didn't say goodbye, just vanished." There was silence after that, the kind that asks more questions than it answers. "You've been running ever since," Martha finally said. He nodded, "Until here." And then something shifted, not in the air, not in the earth, but in her. The same woman who had once walked into the woods to let the cold take her, now reached out, just slightly, and touched his shoulder. "I'm not asking you to leave," she said. And he didn't. They didn't pretend it would be easy. The world didn't forgive people like them. A woman with scars the town couldn't forget. A man with blood on his past. A child with a name borrowed from the dead. But they chose not to run, not this time. That night, Ellis didn't stand watch out of fear. He sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap, because that's what guardians do, not warriors. Not outlaws, just people who stay when it matters. And inside, under the same roof that had once only known loss, 3 lives breathed the same air. They didn't need to explain themselves. They just needed to keep building something strong enough to hold the truth. Because sometimes the past catches up not to break you, but to see if you're finally ready to stop running. And when it does, all you can do is stand there, heart steady, and say, "Yes, that was me. But I'm still here." There are moments when a person crosses a line, not by accident, but by decision. Not because they're fearless, but because they're finished being afraid. The morning Martha rode into town, the streets were still quiet. No children laughing. No church bells ringing, just the slow creak of wooden signs in the wind and the sound of hooves on dry earth. She wore no dress of defiance. Just a simple coat, a braid down her back, and a rifle strapped across her shoulders, not to threaten, but to declare, "I'm not hiding anymore." Marshall Dent was already in the saloon, seated beneath a flickering lamp, flanked by 2 deputies who wore their weapons like trophies. He didn't rise when she walked in. Just looked at her with that same amused smirk, like he couldn't believe. She had the nerve to face him on his turf. "You want Ellis?" she said, her voice steady as stone. "Then come take him." There was silence, heavy and still. "But know this," she continued, stepping forward. "If you cross my land, with weapons drawn, you won't leave it the same man." He laughed, not loud, just enough to show his teeth. "Is that a threat, Miss Walker?" "No," she replied. "It's a promise." And then she turned and walked out, because sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't to fight, but to stand. Back at the cabin, the sky had begun to shift. The air tasted different, sharp and metallic like the moment before lightning strikes. Ellis stood by the fence, tightening the gate. Thomas helped where he could, moving slowly with a quiet focus, as if he understood something was about to change. Then they heard it. The rhythmic beat of hooves, not rushed, not loud, but steady, like a drumbeat from the hills, like history returning to collect its due. 50 Comanche riders approached, silent as wind, their faces painted not for war, but for memory. At their front rode a tall man, shoulders broad, hair braided with silver. He did not look at Ellis. He did not look at the land. He looked at Martha, and then finally at the boy. No one reached for a weapon. No one shouted. The tension wasn't violent. It was sacred. The man dismounted, walked forward, stood still. And then he did something no one expected. He knelt, not to surrender, not to plead, but to offer a choice. He turned to Thomas, speaking words in Comanche, his voice gentle but firm. Words of home, of blood, of a name that belonged to him before all this. And Thomas, this boy who had known fear and loss and warmth again, looked not at the warrior before him, but at the woman beside him. He stepped forward, small, barefoot, trembling, and he took Martha's hand. There were no words. Just that gesture, his fingers sliding into hers, small and certain. The man, Thomas's father, looked at them both. And then slowly he nodded, not as a gesture of thanks, not out of defeat, but out of recognition. This woman had saved his son, not just from death, but from the kind of loneliness that swallows people whole. And for that, she was no longer just an outsider. She was part of the story now. The Comanche didn't stay. They didn't make speeches. They bowed their heads, turned their horses, and vanished back into the hills, like smoke returning to the wind. And when they were gone, Martha stood there, holding Thomas's hand with Ellis beside her, and something old and hard in her chest cracked open. Because when it came down to it, no one had to choose sides. Only truth, and truth had chosen her. She wasn't the woman they whispered about anymore. She wasn't the widow with the scar, or the strange boy in the window, or the drifter in the barn. She was mother. She was home. And for the first time in years, maybe ever, she understood something that had once felt impossible. You don't have to belong to a place to protect it. You just have to choose to stay when it matters most. 3 days after the riders disappeared into the hills, the town gathered at the chapel. There were no flowers, no music, no whispered prayers drifting between the pews. Just hands held over worn wood, quiet footsteps on old floorboards, and a silence that this time felt reverent, not judgmental. Martha didn't wear white. Ellis didn't wear a suit. But she had a necklace of hawk feathers tied around her wrist, a gift from Thomas, now solemn in a shirt 2 sizes too big, seated in the front row with a heart steadier than most grown men. They didn't need vows, not really. Their promises had already been spoken in firelight, in cold mornings, in the way they chose to stay when walking away might have been easier. The preacher's voice trembled as he blessed the union, not from emotion, but from the realization that maybe he'd been wrong. That this woman, once pushed to the edges of their world, hadn't come to curse them, but to teach them something. They had forgotten what grace really looks like. And though many in town still turned their heads as Martha passed, a few didn't. The blacksmith nodded when he saw her. The baker started wrapping an extra loaf in her order. Even Mrs. Avery, once so quick with her venom, now lowered her eyes when they met. Change, like spring thaw, doesn't arrive all at once. It drips, it softens. It carves its way through old stone slow, but unstoppable. Out on the land behind the cabin, Ellis found iron and wood buried deep under years of disused scraps, from a ranch that had once dreamed of life before it was abandoned to silence. Together, the three of them began again. Fence posts were measured, a smokehouse raised, seeds planted in rows so straight they looked like prayers pressed into soil. They built with bare hands, with splinters and bruises, with quiet laughter and shared glances. They didn't talk about what had been taken. They didn't count their scars. They only counted what they were growing now, one board, one breath, one day at a time. Thomas laughed more now. Not the short, uncertain giggles of a boy trying to be invisible, but the loud, wild joy of someone who finally believes they are safe. His name echoed across the fields. A name given to him not by blood, but by love. A name chosen not to erase his past, but to honor both it and the future he was building. And Martha no longer looked over her shoulder when she walked into town. She no longer wore shame like a second skin. The scar on her face didn't fade, but somehow it began to glow differently in the light, not as a wound, but as a crown. Ellis stayed by her side, not as a protector, not as a savior, but as a partner. He no longer ran from his past because this place, this family, had given him something stronger than escape, a reason to belong. Then winter came. The kind of winter that muffled everything, that buried fences in snowdrifts, and made the world feel like it was holding its breath. But inside the cabin, the fire stayed alive. They fed it with wood and stories, with silence and warmth. One evening, snow fell soft and slow beyond the glass. Martha sat by the fire. Thomas curled against her side, humming that same Comanche tune beneath his breath. Ellis mended a saddle, his hands steady, his eyes calm. "You ever think we'd get here?" he asked, not looking up. "No," she answered, brushing her fingers through Thomas's hair. "But I stopped waiting for someone else to rescue me." He looked at her then, and took her hand, not tightly, not desperately, but with the quiet certainty of someone who finally understood. Some people aren't meant to be saved. They're meant to survive. And when they do, when they rise from their own ashes not cleaner, but stronger, they become something this world desperately needs more of. Proof that healing isn't a miracle, it's a choice made in fire, built in silence, and carried forward one sunrise at a time.